Alright, punks, it's time for another round of baseless rumours, wild rampant speculation, and dark insinuation about Warhammer the Old World, based on that rather thin announcement that Games Workshop have just put out about the rules. So, see those trophies over there? They prove that I've got an above average understanding of those rules, so listen up to my monologue. So, the first thing they say is that they wanted to create a modern game in the mould of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and a reimagining. Apart from the fact that reimagining sounds like the kind of thing one might read in a modern art gallery, don't like the sound of that. That seems superficially fair enough. But what does modern mean when it comes to Warhammer? Why was the Warhammer of the past not modern, apart from the fact that it all happened rather a long time ago, so that's rather a pointless statement. Are modern games quick, simplistic, inclusive, accessible? What do they mean by that? I wish they wouldn't use the term modern, it's a vapid term. They say that they've spent several months closeted in some kind of gaming laboratory, remembering all of the different editions. Some of them haven't played it for 10 years, and quite frankly, more fool them. They should have been playing Warhammer in all that time, even though Games Workshop weren't supporting it. The first substantial thing they say, however, to return to perhaps a more calm measure of analysis, is they talk about formations. Now, formations are of course something very important in Warhammer. You could have a very wide formation, which would mean that more of your guys fought, or you could have more ranks, which meant more of a rank bonus, or in 8th edition, it also meant being more likely to be steadfast. That is, to be able to take a break test on your unmodified leadership and thus be less likely to run away. Now, they say here that they want to encourage units with wide frontages to get as many models as possible to fight, and are going to apparently, in the rules, allow warriors who are not in base-to-base contact with the enemy to swing their attacks. Now, this is all quite interesting. Now, first of all, consider what the status quo is inherited from 8th edition. So the first thing is that in 8th edition, your second rank could already fight. And if you had a horde formation, that is to say that you are 10 models wide, your second rank could fight as well as your third rank. So you were bringing a lot of attacks to the party. Also consider that if even your diagonals were locked with the enemies, your extra models could fight, which meant that you had 7 dudes who were fighting 5 dudes, those guys on the end could also swing. So quite a lot of models were already fighting in Warhammer 8th edition, and so a lot of dice got rolled in hand-to-hand combat compared to in previous editions where obviously you didn't have step up and you didn't have the second rank fighting. Now, if they're going to allow even more models to fight from before, like for example, if I have a frontage of 10 and you have a frontage of 5, all 10 of my guys get to swing, then probably quite a lot more dice are going to be brought to the party. Now, that's not something that everyone is necessarily going to like. A lot of dice were rolled in 8th edition combat, and a lot of models died. That meant that the fixed aspects of combat resolution, that is to say things like standards, rank bonus, outnumbering, even though they didn't have outnumbering in 8th edition, contributed comparatively less vis-a-vis the sheer number of models that died. Now, if you go back to older editions, a lot less models die in combat, and those fixed combat factors matter quite a lot more, and that's something that the people who say really like 6th edition rather like about that. It sounds as though they're probably going the way of 8th edition, and they're going to be bringing a lot of dice to the party in combat. Next thing, I think they've got to get the balance right with that formation thing. If they're letting as many models as possible fight, fairly obviously, players are going to want to have as wide a formation as possible to maximise the number of guys that can get to swing. So they've got to have some good rules there about rank bonuses, and probably I would speculate steadfast is going to be in there. Because if it's just about rank bonuses, and you're letting that number of models swing, and you're still having combat results based on casualty removal, you've got to find a way of making those ranks count a little bit more. And so for that reason, I'd wager that steadfast is probably going to be in the rules, and that's going to be something that's going to divide opinion, like most things to do with this game. Also, one other thing, Sometimes, in previous editions of Warhammer, minimising your frontage could actually be quite a deliberate strategy. Sometimes rather a gamey one, darts, for example, but just generally, if I've got, say, a number of very elite fighters, and they've got a small frontage, they can do quite a lot of damage compared to, say, an average opponent, who can only bring a certain number of attacks to bear because his frontage isn't as large. That's just an important dynamic of the rules there that they're perhaps letting fall by the wayside. Minimising and maximising frontages is an extra dynamic of nuance that was achieved by allowing only those with base-to-base contact that could fight. If they're going to just allow everyone to fight, then the actual sort of footprint of the unit versus the footprint of other units matters just a little bit less than it would have done before. And so that aspect of the game perhaps might just simply be simplified. Also consider that maximising the number of models that could fight was also quite important in things like charges. For example, you had to wheel to bring in the maximum number of your guys that could fight and the maximum number of enemies. And all that relied on the dynamics of base to base. If it's just however many guys I've got in the front rank or 2 ranks versus however many guys you've got in those ranks, it's all just a bit more simple and streamlined. And maybe modern, if that's what they think that word means. So, I'm not sure what I think about that. Worried that it's maybe going to turn into a little bit of a dice-a-thon there, but, as with everything, the devil is in the detail. So, let's work out what they actually mean when the rules actually come. All of these announcements here are all a little bit sort of half-baked. Maybe they like feeding the rumour mill. Anyway, the next thing they talk about is breaking the enemy. Now, it says, units that lose a round of combat will often give ground reluctantly rather than immediately breaking and fleeing, while the winner can advance to press their advantage. Now, when I first read this, I thought this sounded great, but there's another potential thing there that I don't like that could maybe be one reading of the rules. Now, what I hope it means, or doesn't mean, is that fleeing is gone. Because fleeing, in and of itself, that you take a break test and the loser flees, is a massive part of the Warhammer rules. There isn't just this sort of Age of Sigmar thing where you just a few guys run away. The whole unit runs away in Warhammer, and you can butcher the wholesale if you catch it. The whole thing with pursuing and the dynamics of fleeing are very, very important and very nuanced and admittedly very complex and probably not very modern part of the rules. Now, I don't know if that interpretation of the rules rather than breaking and fleeing can lead us to believe that they're getting rid of the breaking and fleeing mechanic and replacing it with something else. I hope not. Now, let's assume the optimistic case, that we're still going to have breaking and fleeing, but yet there is going to be a pushback mechanic, which is what this giving ground reluctantly sounds like to me. For example, as it was in the dim and distant land of 3rd edition, if you lost a round of close combat, you were pushed 2 inches backwards whether you held or not. Now, this gaining ground idea is very interesting, because of course pushing your enemy backwards might allow the victorious side to gain some kind of advantage, potentially with an objective or potentially just a strategic advantage vis-a-vis where the units are on the board. It could also be used to advantage the enemy as well. If you allow a unit to fall back, that might potentially open up the flank of the aggressor unit to a countercharge by you. So there are quite a lot of interesting dynamics with a pushback mechanic. But I want that pushback mechanic to be there on top of the traditional breaking and fleeing. But if they're bringing back something from 3rd ed, I really like that. 3rd edition also had a mechanic called the free hack as well, which is to say that if a unit broke and fled in 3rd ed, you didn't actually kill them all if you caught them, you just got some extra free attacks at them to simulate your warriors taking free hacks at them as they broke and fled. That would also be rather interesting. The next and final thing they really talk about is something called the power of magic. Magic is probably one of the things in all of the editions of Warhammer that is the subject of the most argument and the most divergence of opinions between fans. So, many people used to say magic was too powerful in 4th edition and even 5th edition. Sometimes they said it wasn't powerful enough in 6th edition, or it worked in a way that if you had sort of a lot more wizards than your opponent, you just got magical domination and he didn't get to cast very much or anything. And in 8th edition, magic had very many enemies, because of spells like the Purple Sun, the Dwellers Below, the Cacophonic Choir, Occam's Mind Razor, and the laundry list of rather cheesy examples goes on. Now, I would make one important differentiation here. When I see this being discussed on the internet, I think sometimes people are complaining about overpowered spells rather than the actual magic system itself. I think that the magic system in most of the editions of Warhammer Fantasy was actually really good. If you remember the old card-driven system in 4th and 5th ed, that was very exciting. Having like a hand of poker cards in front of you, ready to dish out your Dispel or your Power or your Total Power cards. That was all rather exciting. As for the 8th edition magic, I also think that was excellent. So in 8th edition, you had a central pool of resources that you got primarily from the Winds of Magic, but could get extra dice from other things, and then used your wizards to cast spells using that central pool of power management. Ditto, your opponent did that with dispels. There were also mechanics like broken concentration in 8th edition as well, so you had to really think about how many dice you were going to throw at a spell. Now, that's all very different from the spells themselves sometimes being overpowered. I think that the magic system in 8th edition, of the dice-based systems I should say, was pretty optimal. Just some of the spells were a bit too strong. So anyway, they say that spells don't decide the game anymore. So that sounds like a little bit of a sort of a pushback against the perception that in 8th ed they did decide the game. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, but it looks as though this is going to be a little bit of an anti-magic kind of edition, a bit like 6th ed. That's going to be, I think, probably quite a lot of people's tastes. Not really mine, but, you can't have everything, and I don't necessarily mind that in theory. Now, the next things they talk about are about spellcasting itself, and they say that spellcasting has been liberated. Another very modern kind of word. And apparently, it's going to be there throughout all the phases of the game, rather than just in one phase. That sounds very exciting. I suppose it does sound a bit liberating. It also sounds rather anarchistic as well, and rather chaotic to my sensibilities. I rather like the idea of magic occupying its own phase, but then I'm an old fuddy-duddy reactionary with Warhammer, so perhaps I'll have to start getting used to it. Now, in all seriousness, there is a point I wanted to make about this. If there's no magic phase, how are you going to apply resource management? Now, consider that when there is a magic phase, there was usually a power resource represented by power dice or power cards, and a dispel resource, dispel dice, dispel cards, and players had to manage that, and that's how magic happened or was stopped. If spells are going to be taking place throughout the turn, presumably, if there is a central sort of system of resources that power the wizards, that's going to be there throughout the turn. Maybe it's going to be a certain number of dice that I can just use on any phase throughout the turn, whether it's shooting or combat or whatever. Maybe wizards are going to have fixed mana pools, like they used to in 3rd edition. That would be another way of creating a resource to manage. What I hope it isn't is just me rolling 2d6 to get a spell, maybe with some modifiers, and then if your wizard is close enough to me, him rolling 2d6 to beat me. And if I succeed, I get the spell off. That would all be rather minimalistic and a little bit bland. So I hope there's going to be some resource management system here, and that it just applies throughout the whole turn rather than being slotted into one phase. Very interesting, very innovative, potentially catastrophic, but we'll have to just see what the actual announcement is. Just like all of the other things I've said, which is why this video is mainly baseless speculation. The final thing they say is they talk about the focus changes to positioning of wizards as carefully as other units. I think that's a little bit of a straw man, because I think that positioning wizards in Warhammer has always been important. You need to make sure that your spell is in range, that's the first thing. You need to make sure that your caster has forward arc, that is to say 90 degrees, and he can see his target. If it's a magic missile, it needs to be viable for that. If it's a hex spell, it needs to be viable for that. So positioning wizards was always very important, so I'm not sure why they say that. It is true that wizards didn't need ever to be positioned to dispel things, and it seems as though they will be now. That seems like an interesting mechanic to me. But it could be that wizards have become a little bit sort of aura-based, which is to say, I make sure my wizard is within 12 of this and 12 of that, so it gets +1 to hit, or something like that. Based on my rather superficial understanding of Age of Sigmar, that's what Age of Sigmar is a little bit more like. Now, apart from a natural kind of sort of knee-jerk revulsion to new things, or anything that might be like my probably incorrect imagination of Age of Sigmar, sorry, I don't much like the sound of this, but who can say? Again, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as it always is. And that's really the substance of what they've said about the rules. I am surprised, I have to say, that given this game is rumoured to be out this year, and look, I don't have any inside information on that, so you'll have to go somewhere else to get that. Maybe it will, maybe it won't be. But we haven't heard more things about the rules than we have, and all of this is still all rather a little bit thin. But nonetheless, still very interesting, and does, I think, suggest that this new game is probably going to be, in many respects, quite a substantial departure from 8th edition, and is not just going to sort of be a kind of patched up version of that, which at certain points it looked more like it would. Now, just a few things about some of the pictures. Now, I haven't commented on any of the new models they've released, which have been a Bretonnian Paladin on foot, Bretonnian Paladin Battle Standard Bearer, and a Tomb King. Mainly because I don't think viewers of this channel would find my views on models particularly interesting or enlightening, because they're mainly that of a grumpy old man who thinks that models have been in systematic and steady decline since about 1991. But I will say I thought the models were okay, although I didn't really like that Bretonnian Battle Standard Bearer, because clearly the scale on that model is ridiculous. His horse had been on some kind of growth hormone steroids, was absolutely massive, and he'd look like an absolute douchebag if you put him in a conventional unit of knights. I think that rather does prove that there is going to be scale creep after all, despite the fact that they said that there wouldn't be, and might mean that an army of Warhammer the Old World models will look great together proportionally with their sort of Marvel superhero style anatomy, but won't look so good if you miss and match them with models of other editions. That's not something that surprises me that much. But anyway, I've got my ancient models, and I think model designing has been going down the pan since the early 90s, so probably shouldn't listen to me too much about that. I gather a lot of other people love them. But there is something a bit more serious here. On this announcement, there are 3 images of Warhammer games being played. Now, one of those images particularly, which is the one of an Orc battle line versus Empire, looks as though it could actually be from a game, rather than a slightly kind of posed image that they're, just created to look good in, say, a magazine. This one has, for example, depleted and uneven ranks. Some of the Orcs and some of the Trolls look as though they've taken a few casualties on the way in, or maybe they just started with a number of models in those units that didn't create a full rank. That looks pretty cool to me, and something that I quite like. As for the battle line itself, I can't dispute that apart from the bigger bases, which I don't really like, it's a thing of beauty. Some of those bases, incidentally, look as though they're the regular bases. Those Trolls look like they're on 40mm bases to me, and some of those chariot things, like that kind of Luminarch, look as though they're on the traditional chariot size based. Someone might have to get Photoshop out and do a zoom function and try and work that out. So that might imply that not all of the base sizes are changing. But, fundamentally, if Warhammer the Old World looks like that on the table, regardless of the rules, quite frankly, I'm more happy than unhappy, despite the fact I've spent much of this video grumbling. Well, there we are. Not perhaps too much new, but it's interesting when some rules updates actually arrive, and I hope they're going to be telling us a little bit more than they have. Alright, punks, chummers, time to get back on the bike, to hit the road again. And next time when we stop, hopefully we'll have a bit more to talk about. Put my sunglasses on properly. Alright, later, Ace.